From CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, this is The Worlds We Want, a podcast powered by Future Earth. I'm Tristan Mason.
I'm Cheryl Gladue.
And I'm Joel Ojic.
And it's October 25th. This is episode 2, part 1, and today we are looking into...
So the word is transdisciplinary.
Transdisciplinary?
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 Transdisciplinary.
Future Earth has a mandate to explore transdisciplinary research. But what does that even mean?
Transdisciplinarity is a very catchy topic in academia right now, especially amongst sustainable scientists who work on sustainability challenges or global environmental change. But by no means is it a really kind of settled definition. So for me, it's really about working interdisciplinary across academia. But it's also about engaging with stakeholders to find solutions. And that's important when we're working with wicked problems because the trade-offs are very complex and difficult to see. So you need to know what different perspectives are on what those might be.
That's Christina Cook, science officer at Future Earth, who we met on the last episode of The Worlds We Want. Now, some of you might be familiar with other kinds of research, such as multi- or interdisciplinary research. For example, there are over 100 interdisciplinary graduate students at Concordia University in the INDI program. They have committee members that are in different disciplines, yet there is a central problem that connects them. It turns out it's really not that uncommon for many of these students to be addressing some issue pertaining to sustainability. Let's let Hannah Mursberger, a Capacity and Research Enabling Officer at Future's Paris Hub, start to break down some of these terms.
You have different scientists from different backgrounds working together on one project. So you have, let's say, ecologists working together with economists and biologists, and they form a project together.
We also asked Gordon McBain, president of the International Council for Science and co-chair of Future Earth's Governing Council, to define transdisciplinary research.
Well, I can try.
And he compared this to another kind of cross-disciplinary research, namely multidisciplinarity.
We, first of all, not try and stress the idea of what some people use the word multidisciplinary, that a person can be the world's best physicist and the world's best social scientist, biologist, chemist, economist at the same time. That's, first of all, I don't think that's possible, and secondly, it's not what we want. What we want is outstanding scientists in, say, economics, in psychology, in biology, in chemistry, who are, let's say, willing and interested in working together with other disciplines, and they learn to communicate by using not quite so much their sort of vested dialogue thing. So you can build teams of people who are very good in their discipline, but agree and understand and take a very positive attitude towards dealing with people in other disciplines in a way they can learn from each other.
So at the base of it, Future Earth considers transdisciplinarity to be a willingness to work with other people who have different education and different specializations than you in academia. But it goes beyond that, as it often engages other players, such as policymakers.
I think, as I mentioned, my work in UNESCO, my specialty is satellite images. And my work with UNESCO brought me to work directly with archaeologists, that they don't know anything about satellite images. And that forced me to provide them a ready-to-use result where they don't care about my own jargon, my own technology, they just need the end result. And that's when I saw Future Earth as a transdisciplinary research platform. I said, this is the way we need to go. We need to modify the way we work. We cannot work anymore in our own discipline because the world is not like that. And we need to open us to the others, and it's very complex. We need to change our language, we need to change our way we communicate. It's very easy to communicate with your own peers, it's very difficult to communicate with the others. And that's what attracted me about Future Earth, the part of transdisciplinary. Also working with World Heritage Sites, I was working very much with the authorities. Sometimes we show the results, and we needed to be honest with the authorities, telling them tell us what we can say to the public and tell us what we cannot say to the public, in order that he became a real partner, so that he sees that we are really here to help you, not to criticize you. And that's another issue that is attractive for Future Earth, that this research is for policy support. Although we are far from being there, but that's the goal, is for policy support. So working with other disciplines towards policy support for a better world, I think everybody should be doing it.
That was Professor Mario Hernandez Valdez talking about how transdisciplinary work brought him to work not only with other scholars, but with policymakers as well. And to push this even further, transdisciplinary research also work with the broader community, for instance, unions, business people, and community members. Here is Hannah Mursberger again.
If you work on a transdisciplinary project, you would have the ecologist, the economist, the biologist, and then they reach out to a fishery organization because they're looking at, let's say, coastal areas. And so they're asking fishermen what's their experience, what's their knowledge also. And then they might ask a trade conglomeration, a coastal trade conglomeration to provide their kinds of inputs. So it's really, to reach out to people who are not in academics and who are not scientists per se.
I think we have to back up before we go too far down the transdisciplinary rabbit hole and talk a little bit about disciplines more generally, so that we can understand that isn't some esoteric concept that's really only important to a select group of academics to understand. A discipline, of course, refers not only to the faculty that a researcher belongs to, but also the academic journals that they might publish in. As an example, within the fine arts, you have people who study visual or performing arts. And then, say, within the visual arts, you have people who study in different fields, such as fine arts, which could include painting and sculpture, or applied arts, such as design or animation, so on and so forth. Each step away from the main faculty leads to an ever-increasing level of specialization within that field. And this makes sense in a way because each person is trying to contribute to the creation of new knowledge, and this requires what's sometimes called laying bricks. That is, each contribution alone doesn't support the edifice of a big idea or theory, but together, over time, they can. The problem, of course, is that this can be a little bit like Humpty Dumpty. Taking things apart into little manageable pieces doesn't mean you can put them back together again, into something we might consider a coherent whole. It can be difficult to zoom out and see if and how the pieces assemble, especially if your knowledge base is highly specialized. This is especially true when dealing with complex problems. You'll note that Christina Cook had described these kinds of problems as wicked problems.
What is a wicked problem, you ask? The term wicked problem is credited to a 1973 paper by design and planning theorists Horst Riddle and Melvin M. Weber. In their paper, Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, they compared wicked problems to ordinary or tame problems. They suggested that wicked problems were not only difficult but likely impossible to solve in a fully satisfactory fashion. A few of the more common characteristics of wicked problems are their fundamental uniqueness, making learning from past experiments challenging or even impossible. What's more, you don't really understand the full nature of the problem until you've developed some kind of a solution, which is kind of backwards when you think about it. This is because the problem isn't clearly structured and is made up of an ever-developing set of interconnected issues and constraints. As such, there are no right or wrong solutions, simply better, worse, and/or good enough type solutions. And finally, it is really difficult to test out solutions to wicked problems in advance, which makes undertaking them inherently risky, especially because this happens outside of a laboratory setting. And this points to the real crux of it. These kind of problems are always taking place in a social context, so there are a diversity of stakeholders that are to be considered in implementing any potential solution, and this is where the challenge really lies. It's in the social complexity of these problems that makes them wicked, not their technical complexity.
Working on a World Heritage Site, I don't want to mention the site in particular, we observed that during the last 25 years there was a very strong deforestation. So we show the satellite images to the authorities, and yes, they said, well, there's a tremendous deforestation, but, and so what? And for the first time I said to myself, yeah, and so what? My job in the satellite image ends there. And so we started seeing, we need to understand why the people are cutting the forest. If there is a law, why the law is not being enforced, or what type of laws do we need? If we stop the people cutting the forest, what alternatives can we offer to them? So then I started seeing, in order to provide the full solution, my satellite images are far from being enough. I need to work with legal people, with lawyers. I need to work with anthropologists that can help me to see what alternatives can we offer. And we started doing it in order to try to offer a full solution of the problem. But the problem is very complex, and without the help of the other disciplines, your solution always remains too short.
That again was Mario Hernandez Valdez demonstrating the way that social complexity can overwhelm problem-solving and project management approaches to solution finding, which is why Future Earth is encouraging researchers to work in a transdisciplinary fashion. Because the twin issues of climate change and the Great Acceleration, while requiring some technical fixes, are very much problems related to society and how some of us work and live.
So transdisciplinary research can help us try to address complex problems, and these kinds of problems highlight the interaction between disciplines that might not seem obviously related from the outset. Imagine for a second that a geography student was asked to collaborate on a project with a medical student. What might that look like?
My name is Charles Ebikemi. My title is Science Officer at the International Council for Science. It means sort of going beyond the disciplines. It's so my background is in sort of as a biochemist. So some people would call that one discipline, but it's actually sort of the beautiful intersection of two disciplines. Right. So, and Future Earth really sort of goes a little bit, sort of takes that to its furthest logical conclusion. It's about really sort of disciplines working not only among themselves and sort of out with themselves, but also engaging with sort of policymakers and people, society in general. I mean, that's the basic framework. It's science and society sort of engaging in a way to conquer challenges, and that's what Future Earth is about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you're a specialist in infectious diseases.
Yes, I am, yeah.
How does that tie into Future Earth's vision?
So Future Earth really, it covers a wide range of issues. I mean, most importantly, recently I've worked on sort of Future Earth's initiatives on health and Future Earth's initiatives on urbanization. And these things are sort of, sometimes you talk about them and we're sort of separate things, but really they're very much interrelated. I mean, as an infectious disease person, Ebola, everyone's heard of Ebola, and that was a thoroughly urban disease. Right. And we're seeing more and more the urban pandemics are really sort of as a result of this sort of urbanization in general. I mean, the simplicity and ease of getting from one center of one city center to another within the same sort of region has really sort of opened the door into the types of pandemics that we could really see in the future, not just from Ebola, but from other diseases such as yellow fever and things like this.
More than just addressing some really important areas of research, such as those described by Charles, transdisciplinary research can help build trust with and between stakeholders as they are brought into the process of developing solutions together. As Christina Cook pointed out,
there's a legitimacy issue. So when people have participated in the research and the solutions finding, the ability to implement the solution is generally improved. And if you get people on board early enough, so policymakers, etc., that also helps in the ability to implement the solution. So you can start to turn the policy direction and put in place the legislative changes that you need over that period of time. People are prepared for it. They're buying in as we go along.
Hannah also drew attention to the fact that these people are not simply excellent partners to have in developing research, but they also are
on the front line of changing, actually, really changing something, because scientists provide the knowledge how to, but in the end it's up to people to actually do it.
It's by working jointly, and that Future Earth calls the co-design and the co-production. So you need to work with me so that you see the benefits of what we too are doing. It's not me and it's not you. We are developing a joint product for you.
That last voice, of course, was Mario Hernandez Valdez, who we heard from earlier. Most of us can agree that climate change and the Great Acceleration require fundamental shifts in behavior, for instance, related to what and how much we consume certain resources. However, it's difficult to think that people will engage with these changes in behavior if they do not feel that they are important or legitimate. We will address the issue of communication of environmental challenges and how this is extremely difficult given conditions such as politically motivated climate change denial on a later show. But for now, it's important to consider the role of transdisciplinary research in helping not only guide the research through the collection of information from a particular audience of interest, like you might in a marketing or polling survey, but the potential for co-education and how participants are able to learn not only about the issue, but also about how science works through such projects.
There's great value in sort of experiential learning. So when people in a community are brought into a space in which they might work on a solution for a problem that they're experiencing, that's a way of getting them to come to a more common understanding. It takes a lot of time, of course, but I think it's the work that we need to do to make progress on these issues.
As another example, my research has allowed me to talk extensively with members of Canadian co-housing communities who undertake the process to collaboratively design and develop whole neighborhoods together. And I have to say, one of the things I've observed in talking with these people is not only does their sharing of ideas lead to the development of highly functional and award-winning neighborhoods, but the members of the community seem to have a much deeper appreciation for the complexity of real estate development than would, say, a person who just bought into a condo project. I mean, it seems obvious, right? But when we keep people out of the processes that contribute to the development of the world around them, for whatever reason, some likely quite practical, there's the potential for suspicion to develop as to the motives of those doing the things that they're doing, be it artists that seek public grants to do their work or scientists who do the same. Pulling back the curtain on some of these processes allow a wider cross-section of people to better understand the context in which some very important decisions are made and how we as laypeople can contribute to making sense of it all.
As an outsider, this might seem all too intuitive. So why is this a current topic of discussion? Why is this new or difficult to do? On the one hand, it can be hard for researchers who are not used to working with people in different fields to collaborate deeply on a project.
It's easy to deal with multidisciplinary research. People come with their own ideas and work with them. The focus of transdisciplinarity, the way I understand it, is to be able to actually do it co-jointly right at the beginning, rather than somebody coming with their own. Yes, of course, you have to have an in-depth understanding of where you're coming from, if you are a fish expert or whatever the case may be. But in sitting around, one of the critical challenges, and perhaps the exciting part, is the increasing conversation about co-design and co-research and co-working together. So there's always been conversations in the past when, for instance, social scientists would claim to say, well, you know, the natural scientists started off with an idea and then they come and call us at the last minute to say, how do you contribute to this particular part? But what you want to do is right from the word go, for the social scientists perhaps putting on the table, how does this affect the behavior of individuals and people? And for a natural scientist to put on the table. So the core design of a problem is by different people and that particular part. The difficulty, of course, has been that kind of engagement. The lessons we learn about human interaction in terms of designing things is not just as simple as psychology and say there are some of those who are more enthusiastic than others. It's the ability to perhaps be patient, perhaps give others a chance to express themselves. So the interesting part of the transdisciplinarity is, of course, even the learning how to do it.
That was Andrew Kaniki, Executive Director for Knowledge Fields Development at the South African National Research Foundation. In addition to the learning curve for participants, there are challenges that are rooted in the existing structures of academia, including the reward structures. Here again is Gordon McBain, who's trained as a climatologist with a PhD in physics.
Well, I think one thing is we need to do is, first of all, redo a bit rethinking of our traditional structures. I don't know if you're aware that the Future Earth Planning Committee, which I was not part of, but we asked them early on in the process, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to achieving this transdisciplinary approach for Future Earth? And they had several, but two of them that were quite important was one is the traditional structure of universities. And I know at my university is a very traditional university. And I may bring in more research grants, have more students, and bring in more money and publish more papers than almost anyone in the department, but they can't really appoint me, for sure, because I don't have a degree in geography. And similarly, that kind of thing happens. The other thing that is also an issue in Canada is the structure of our honors societies. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. I was elected back in, 92 or 3, to the Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences Division, because that's what I did then. And I don't know, maybe roughly 7 or 8 years ago, they asked me to chair the division of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences Division, which meant my main job was to chair the meetings where we actually decided who would be the new fellows. And first of all, we got to change the name from fellows to something that's quite so gender specific, but that aside. But the point is that we have to build across that bridge and say, okay, because I mean, to break down these barriers and get in this idea that people can work together and work across departments within universities, across faculties, and within the disciplines in terms of our societies and things. And that, I think, is so important to address that issues that we have to find ways of solving it. Part of it is, as I referred to earlier, this communications dialogue problem. We have to learn to understand how to, let's say, explain what we do in ways that that other people can understand, not making it trivialized, but to avoid using, let's say, a fixed set of jargon that for our discipline that doesn't match in meaning with the jargon used in another discipline. And they have to, whoever they are, have to switch a bit too. And we have to encourage this kind of thing. That means university presidents have to be willing to, well, cause these things to happen.
We are going to have a longer conversation on this particular challenge, as well as the opacity of the word transdisciplinarity in the second part of the show, when we have a longer conversation with Dr. Jaeger, Associate Professor at Concordia University. Another reason that few researchers work this way is because it's kind of hard to do. It isn't easy work, as it moves us out of our comfort zone and asks us to work with different kinds of people. And this can bring up biases and reveal underlying assumptions in terms of how things do or should work. The challenge for participants is to learn to suspend judgment, and in many instances, their own cherished beliefs in order to understand the nature of the problem from a different perspective, or multiple perspectives even. And most of us don't have a lot of practice doing this.
But still, it's a big challenge actually for social and natural scientists to talk to each other. And it's a big challenge actually for scientists to talk to private business people. Because scientists often think that private business just needs to make money. Yes, they need to make money. And scientists need to look for the newest method, and these are not the same things. So you need to to get them together, and I think that's one of the most important work and task actually the senior people in Future Earth have actually to motivate young people actually to cross boundaries and to come together.
That's Jakob Reiner, co-chair of Future Earth's Governing Council and the vice-rector of the United Nations University. He also provides us with an example of undertaking transdisciplinary research from his work life.
I had the opportunity to become first the division leader and then the director of the Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research. And the theme there was, the purpose of this institute was actually to improve avalanche safety, not only in Switzerland, but we cooperated very internationally also with Canada, by the way. This is a domain actually which when you try to improve safety, you need a lot of science actually. So you can't do it without science. So improving avalanche early warning systems really needs to do a lot of modeling, a lot of observations, geo-observations and so on. So we had, on one hand, we had about 20 PhD students. On the other hand, in the winter, we had to do the daily avalanche forecasts. And the people who do the daily avalanche forecasts, they are typically mountain guides. Some of them are scientists and some of them are not scientists. And to get them together with the people who improve the snow modeling and who improved risk management methods was sometimes quite harsh. They didn't understand each other at all. And when there was a problem, one tried to find the mistake at the side of the other. And this for me was really working transdisciplinary. So the quest for me as a director was actually to kind of get these people together, to find, so to say, let's call it business cases for them actually to work together. And in these very different circumstances in industry actually and in environmental risk management, I found that structurally, the basic way you are kind of handling transdisciplinarity is very similar actually, and it's always caused by constant type of conflicts. The practitioners and the scientists, they sometimes have different minds, and what I learned is that you should not look at these problems just as problems, but as part of the projects, part of the spirit of transdisciplinarity.
Before we close this part of the show, we want to leave you with a few examples of the kinds of projects that people are working on or would like to work on in a transdisciplinary fashion. We'll start by going back to our conversation with Andrew Kinnicky.
Is a community engagement project that University of Stellenbosch and runs within the area of the Stellenbosch area, and the principal investigator, Professor Mark, what he has tried to do is to accommodate a variety of PhD students, postdoc students, and they look at and work with an informal settlement just outside the city to try and find solutions for that particular informal settlement to deal with. Of course, it's not the most popular if you are in a city that is, that's trying to do proper things, and you've got people with tin houses and whatever the case may be. But the students and the researchers have spent time there to try and do, for instance, when I visited that place was to find a doctoral student who was an engineering student trying to design, the kinds of toilets that may be used in those kinds of areas, and use that as a place where you could actually design some, waterless toilets and stuff like that. Doing for his PhD, but in doing so, he's also working with a sociology student in terms of how do you engage the community that is, in that particular informal settlement. Similarly, in terms of even some of the electronics and students that have designed small, almost laptop-like screens for television, communication and stuff like that. So in a way, you get the students right in the middle of, and the university is just a few, meters away, but they actually go and do work in that particular environment. The community has accepted them in a way that, they actually start even generating some income and producing that. So, difficult as it may be for, particularly not just for researchers and for students producing their thesis and everything else, the council, municipality also starts recognizing that. Yes, of course, municipalities don't like to see that. You want to remove those kinds of. But at the end of the day, these are individuals and people who work in the city, but they live in an informal settlement. How do you actually provide the services and at the same time, ensure that it's actually being properly done? So there are opportunities that from us as a research funding agency. You provide the support for research, for whatever, but for the research and the students, of course, they produce the knowledge and actually put some services in a society and community that is, under normal circumstances, you'll be asking and say, oh, what is the science that you're producing here? But in reality, you're also producing solutions. So there are things like that. That's all.
Well, I might give an example from before. Work that I've done before was not strictly speaking part of Future Earth, but which I think is an example of sort of where we worked with researchers from several 5, 6, 7, 8 countries in Southeast Asia, and including China, on the issue of avian influenza, bird flu. And this was in the early 2000s when bird flu had just begun to emerge out of China. Bird flu H5N1 spread to Vietnam and spread very quickly around the world, into Central Asia, into Turkey, West Africa and Europe. And there was a big scare around this, and we started working with researchers and policymakers and research funders in that range of countries to collaborate and to begin to think about not so much how to develop vaccines and what medicines to use, and not a medical approach, but looking at the societal aspects of of these issues. So what kind of policies, for example, were devised, how were they formulated, who was involved in these processes, how to work with farmers to remove some of the enormous pressure that was on farmers to behave in certain ways, to raise chickens in a biosecure way, working with farmers on experiments sort of at the local level, and providing these to policymakers by way of potential solutions to some of the problems. And what was, I think, relatively unique there was that this happened in several countries at the same time, both with researchers but also with policymakers and research funders. So the stakeholders that we talk about in Future Earth were sort of all there.
That last voice was Hein Mallet, professor at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Kyoto, Japan, and coordinator of the Regional Center for Future Earth in Asia.
So if we were to summarize just what transdisciplinary research is, we'd have to first reiterate that it's distinct from multi- and interdisciplinary research. Moreover, to quote Alfonso Monturi in the foreword of the book, Transdisciplinarity, Theory and Practice, quote, "The project of transdisciplinarity is an emancipatory one," unquote, in that it's a new way of thinking about and working in research. Monturi goes on to suggest that transdisciplinary research should be driven by inquiry rather than discipline, and that the purpose of this knowledge creation is to be better able to take action in the world now. The knowledge creation should recognize the presence of various ways of thinking and how these ways of thinking come with their own set of assumptions. He further states that transdisciplinary research recognizes and tries to move away from the decontextualized knowledge typically organized in a disciplinary manner within our institution, and also suggests that we should purposely embed the researcher into the process of inquiry itself. We hope to show you how this works on future shows as we start to share research projects presently underway around the world under the Future Earth umbrella.
And before defenders of disciplinary research get upset or assume that we are suggesting all research should be transdisciplinary research, or that transdisciplinary research is better, that is not what is being said here. Not at all.
Disciplinary research, as much as you need trans or interdisciplinary research, there are some fields where you have to do fundamental science, because this is the only way to approach knowledge. But there are other ways where you have to work across sectors and across disciplines.
What is being proposed here is that it is necessary for certain kinds of research, and that transdisciplinary work is complementary to the traditional disciplinary work. Seeing how all this works together requires a real abundance mindset, a sense that there is something to be gained by inviting other people into academic projects, be this citizens, companies, NGOs, as well as all levels of government. We'll give the last word to Rebecca Oliver, Senior Engagement and Dialogue Lead at Future Earth Sweden Hub.
I think that there is a risk in pretty much all areas of human activity that you feel you know what you're doing, and therefore you have to communicate it. Academia has, for a long time, maybe always, been mainly pedagogic, feeling that they create knowledge and communicate it. And I think that when we're talking about sustainability, we're about understanding how the world really works. And in that sense, we need everybody's knowledge. We need to understand each other's roles. We need to understand the actors in the economic system. We need to understand everything from the small communities to the way the global community works. And I think that is not possible without dialogue. And so with dialogue, I mean not a one-way communication, and dialogue involves a lot of listening. It's not about debating, it's not about conflicting, it's about listening, and it's about having humility in the conversation, because you need to understand your own limitations if you're going to try to create change. And Future Earth is all about trying to create change.
Writing by Cheryl Gladu. Field recording by Arun Dayanandan, Charlie Plaisir, and Cheryl Gladu. Interviews by Tristan Mason, Joel Ojek, Charlie Plaisir, and Cheryl Gladu. Recording and production at CJLO 1690 AM, by Patrick McDowell. Music featured in this episode is Are You Well by Best Fern and Plans Fall Through by Alexia Avina. And of course, the whole thing is powered by Future Earth.
Thank you for joining us. This is The Worlds We Want, Episode 2, Part 2, and I'm Joel Ojic. For the next part of the show, we're going to continue to explore the idea of transdisciplinary research, this time in conversation with Dr. Jaeger, Associate Professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia University.
The following conversation was recorded last week at Concordia University as Professor Jaeger is presenting at a conference this week in Quebec City. At the end of the conversation, we will debrief a bit in studio.
So my name is Jochen Jaeger, and I've been working at Concordia now for 10 years. And my field is really environmental sciences, so the name of our department is Geography, Planning, and Environment, and I'm really in the environmental science part, but I have links to the other two as well. Originally I studied physics actually, and I did my diploma thesis at ETH Zurich in theoretical physics, and then I realized at that time that physics is fantastic, it's interesting, however the environmental issues are much more urgent than the questions that physicists are working on, because in environmental sciences it may be a matter of a few months or a few years how quickly you can find useful solutions for solving all these environmental problems that are mounting at an impressive rate, whereas in physics it doesn't matter so much if we find the answers in 10 years or 20 years.
We just heard a number of researchers from Future Earth talking about transdisciplinary research and what it is, and there was a little bit of a touch on the challenges associated with this, but I would like it if we could go into more detail about that, if you would. Could you talk about some of the challenges associated with doing transdisciplinary research?
Yes, there are quite a few. One of the challenges is that you first have to exist as a scientist, and to do that you have to go through all these hoops and checks that usually only exist in disciplinary research. So you have to establish yourself as a researcher in disciplinary research, and then you're not a young person anymore once you're at that point. And then you're usually supposed to continue this once you have achieved all these things, so to have a permanent job, that there's far too little time left to become serious about transdisciplinary research. I would say transdisciplinary research cannot be done as a side job, and that's what we do right now. Like, we do all the disciplinary work as we have always done before, and then we add on top of that on people who are already overworked to do transdisciplinary research. That's impossible. That's just doing 3 jobs at the same time. That's why there's this big confusion that people think transdisciplinary work means involving stakeholders. And that's something that disciplinary people can do, because we just do all what we did before, and then we somehow have a workshop or meet with them, have some discussions, or we do what they call a dialogue between disciplines. So that's kind of entertaining, that can be inspiring, that's good, but that's not transdisciplinary. That's just a dialogue between disciplines, or it's just getting stakeholders involved, but that can happen in any disciplinary framework as well. So that doesn't make it transdisciplinary, and I think that's one of the conceptual confusions that are around right now. That one is a big one, and many people will not be happy when I say that. That doesn't make it transdisciplinary, or at least not necessarily or not automatically. It can be a very important component, but it's not what really distinguishes transdisciplinary research from other research, because it can happen elsewhere as well. It's a good thing to do, I'm all for it, but I don't think that's the main point.
If I understand this correctly, you're suggesting that these processes can still be very disciplinary in their approach to the problem statement. At what point do you think it becomes transdisciplinary research? Does it involve letting go of the assumptions of any given discipline?
It's a very good question. Talking to stakeholders is a very good idea, and it may widen the horizon. It may even push it towards transdisciplinary research. I think the crucial point really is a matter of priority. Like, in the end, what is driving the researchers and where it's going, is it still coming from a disciplinary history, or is it really subordinated towards under trying to solve this problem and really understand this problem and get rid of all these disciplinary boundaries that may be supportive in certain situations. Like, you probably see that problem. It's very well known in multidisciplinary research, where you have this research group and they work together on an object or topic where each of them is cutting their slice, which is still designed through these disciplinary concepts and categories. And in the end, it's all published in a book, and each discipline or each group has their own chapter in the book. And then at the end, somebody has to try to integrate all of this. And that's too late. You cannot do the integration at the very end. You need to think about the integration at the very beginning. And that's rare. That's very rare. Because if you don't prepare the integration right from the beginning, how are you even distinguishing sub-problems, and where do you bring in disciplinary methods? If you don't know how it's all going to fit together, it's just a matter of good luck if in the end you get some integration out of it. But usually it's even done under time pressure, because the disciplinary work took a lot of time already, and then there's not enough time in the end left. It's very well meant, but the integration usually is of low quality, unfortunately. And that's not enough. So the idea is that you really have the priority on the integration, and then the others are contributing. And that may be a disciplinary contribution, but it may be something very different, something that hasn't existed before. And it's really where this priority needs to change to do that. So I have nothing against disciplines. I think it's very important that scientists have a very, very good disciplinary education, and they know what good science is and what the criteria are to assess that. But these criteria, as you mentioned, need to be further developed. They need to evolve, and certain criteria may not apply in the same way anymore to transdisciplinary research, and additional criteria may be necessary to do that. And that's tricky. It's very exciting, though.
You mentioned that academics have to go through hoops and checks, and by the time they exist, as you put it, it can be very difficult for them to then go on to do transdisciplinary research. Can you describe some of those hoops and checks for the audience?
Yeah, so when I say existence, of course, I mean permanent existence, right? If you have to always think, how will I pay my rent in 2 years, because my postdoc position is for 2 years, and after that I don't know what will happen, then you always are forced to adapt to the pressures of the system. And that has increased a lot over the last 20 years, I would say. Even just the amount of papers that any scientist is expected to publish compared to the situation 40 or 50 years ago, it's just humongous. So publication pressure is one of them, and finding funding. Like the current NSERC, for example, has all these criteria which you have to have done to have any realistic chance of getting funding, and that includes that you need to explain what the expected results will be, more or less. So any researcher who wants to do risky research will not apply there, because it's really anti-risky research. And that's a well-known criticism, but it's not changing. It's just, you basically have to have done the same thing for a few years, have to have pretty good experience with that topic, have to have the methods ready, and it needs to be very likely that the research will be successful, which makes all sense. There are good reasons why we do that, but it doesn't promote risky research. It doesn't promote it. Like, if you want to do something really interesting differently, then you need to find money elsewhere. And there are not that many options for doing that. Yeah, and then also, where would you even publish your results once you do that research, really? So I know of two journals that truly support that. One is Gaia, Ecological Perspectives in Science and Society. That was founded in 1992 in Switzerland. It's bilingual, English and German, who was exactly put there for this purpose, to publish papers that otherwise would never be accepted. And then there's another journal which was originally called Conservation Ecology, and then changed its name to Ecology and Society. It's an online journal. It's very well known. It's very, very good, and they're doing that. And more recently, in the last 5 years, I think there's a sustainability journal by Springer, and I think 1 or 2 others. So I think the publication possibility is not an issue anymore. that has changed. But the issue rather now is we have so many papers being published. Who is going to read all these things? And with this current problem of the predatory journals who publish anything, it becomes more and more difficult to distinguish real journals from fake journals, and then you have these journals in between, which will, I think, lead to a very big confusion in the next few years.
You mentioned in some of your work that transdisciplinary research is independent of the sciences, in particular when defining the problems, and that this can lead to interesting effects. Could you comment on that?
These examples are not simple. So the example I really have in mind is the work of my colleague, Martin Scheringer, and he works in environmental chemistry. And the big important link here is about the connection of assessing chemicals and ethics. So you would have to have a sufficiently good background in philosophy and ethics, and then really say, how does that relate to dealing with chemicals? And that for regular chemists is very surprising. They would typically say environmental chemistry is just the same chemistry, it's just in the environment. What's the big deal? And the difference is much more different, because you really have to think about what are the real problems. And it's all about ethics and justice and distributional justice. And regular chemists would say, well, that's nothing that we would think about. And that's exactly the problem. They don't think about these important questions. So that's where you can have these weird effects. And that could be very, very different in different fields. Like another example that I have in mind is the work by the WBGU, the Wissenschaftliche Beirat für globale Umweltveränderung. So that's the Scientific Council for Global Environmental Change of the German government. And they have done an analysis of so-called syndromes. And that was the immediate link I saw with Future Earth, that they would want to work on these syndromes. And that was a paper in 2001 or so in the journal Gaia. And I always would have loved to follow up more on that. But they look at these syndromes really from what's really there in the real world, and forget about all our scientific background for a moment, all our socialization that we get from disciplines and from getting education in terms of disciplines, because basically all our education is disciplinary so far, to understand all these connections and interactions that would not be included if you look through a disciplinary lens. So I find that approach very, very promising, but I haven't followed it up what has happened in this field with these syndromes over the last 15 years.
Do you think you'd be able to summarize what you think the core aspects of transdisciplinary research are?
The core would really be these three parts. The first one, problem orientation, which I mentioned before. So the research questions are derived from real-world problems. Then second one would be that you find these sub-problems, they're divided up, and a suitable definition of these sub-problems is a prerequisite for the integration of the results. So you think about integration from the very beginning and not as an add-on at the end, not end of the pipe integration. That doesn't work. And then you really have a free choice of the scientific methods that are adequate for each of the sub-problems, which may or may not be disciplinary. And then you look at these close relationships between the sub-problems, because they are crucial for the development of an overall solution. That's what I would say. And each of them, of course, you can discuss in more detail. But I think these are the elements. And if you feel at this point or this point I should include stakeholders, then by all means do so. Mm-hmm. Yes. But you can have maybe theoretical transdisciplinary research. That's because it's really combining things. And I would say this work on environmental chemicals, connecting it with ethics, is a wonderful part of that. It doesn't include stakeholders. I'm always a bit skeptical when people say, oh, it has to have a certain number of participants in the research, because the integration really only happens if it happens in single heads or single brains. If everybody has a piece of the truth, but nobody has everything together, then there is no integration. It's not just happening by everybody having a piece. That's very partial or fragmentary. And transdisciplinary research requires that the integration actually happens in single brains. So that's why I'm a little hesitant, because then you delegate tasks and everybody has a piece of the whole story, but if nobody has the integrated story, then it's not really there.
It seems like this presents a real generalist approach to complex problems within academia.
I agree. I would probably use the word integrative more than generalist.
Yeah.
Because generalist sometimes is confused with superficial, but integrative, that's really true, and I think that's the crux, that's the really tricky part. What is the integration and how does it happen, and who does the integration, in which heads is it, and which papers and which books? And that's where the stakeholders don't necessarily do that. They don't do the integration for you. It's not outreach, right? Outreach is something that all the disciplinary researchers want as well, and that's not transdisciplinary, it's fragmentary.
So it looks like you wrote your first paper on this topic about 20 years ago. Have you noticed any changes in our approach or understanding to transdisciplinarity since then?
I think conditions have mostly changed, that everybody's talking about it right now. It's a little bit like sustainability. Everybody's talking about sustainability. More recently, everybody's talking about resilience. But what has changed is that a few universities have opened up towards transdisciplinarity. There's still this, maybe I shouldn't say confusion, but unclarity what it really means. But there are quite a few efforts that are very well intentioned. Like there's this handbook on transdisciplinarity, which was published in 2008 in Zurich by Gertrude Hirsch-Hardon and Christian Pohl. So there are serious, I would say still serious efforts of going in that direction. There was this transdisciplinary tea conference in 2000 in Switzerland, and others as well. And right now there's one, or just was last month, in Lüneburg, about transdisciplinarity. So quite a few people have become interested, and that is certainly a very good thing because people are making efforts. And that also means there's at least some funding there. And I think quite a few, not all, but some universities have opened up to acknowledge that this is work that scientists should be involved. So that is certainly a good thing. I don't think it's enough, but I'm also hoping that Future Earth will have quite an impact there. So that's why I'm very, very excited that they're here in Montreal and that we can contribute. And I hope there will be serious funding through Future Earth for this type of work, because so far I get all these emails, and communication is important, but it's really not enough.
As somebody who's worked in both Europe and North America as a researcher, thinking about transdisciplinarity, can you describe, are there any differences in how this is done in Europe and North America?
I don't know. They're probably different, but even within Germany, for example, or even other countries, it's quite different. And here in Canada, for example, it's different between universities. It's different between faculties. It's different between departments. And here I'm lucky to be in a geography department, which has always been open to a variety of methods, a variety of approaches. So in a way, a geography department is, well, is it interdisciplinary or perhaps transdisciplinary by definition? So that has been around. What I'm worried about is that some universities have closed their geography departments. Like the ETH Zurich doesn't have a geography department anymore. And I recently heard about another university who are closing down geography, and I think that's the wrong decision. If they at least at the same time would open up a new department for sustainability, okay, then let's do that. But closing down geography, I think, is a step in the wrong direction. But it has to do with increased ideas of what science is and what these criteria, and they felt that geographers don't meet these more and more disciplinary criteria for rigorous science. And that's where I think we are going in the opposite direction than transdisciplinary research.
Do you think that there might be some confusion around the word transdisciplinarity? I mean, there's no mention of stakeholders or involvement of other people in the word, and I'm wondering if that might lead to some confusion.
I think it's still a good word, a good term, a good concept, but it's true. It doesn't say that in the word. So if people are not really careful comparing definitions and then converging on one, there's always the danger of confusion. And you also don't want to end up fighting about words, where in fact you should talk about concepts, and whatever you call it, it doesn't really matter. You want a short word that is easy to use and has some appeal, and I think transdisciplinarity has that, but then you need to define the meaning. But this is common in the sciences or in the social sciences or political sciences, where at some point you need to clarify these terms, and that was true in physics as well. Like there are terms of force and energy and power. That was a huge confusion for decades until this was clarified, and because there are different forms of energy, that doesn't happen very easily and very quickly. So that's a phase that every discipline or other branch of science is going through, trying to clarify their terms.
Hi, this is Tristan. We're back at the studio, and I'm going to turn to Cheryl for some final reflections.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. It's clear to me that there's still some work that has to be done on defining this term. And one thing Dr. Jaeger mentioned after our interview was that there might eventually be a breakdown that describes different kinds of transdisciplinary research, and that's totally normal. What we need are more examples for researchers like Dr. Jaeger to consider and to classify. We don't need a perfect definition to advance these kinds of projects. And these are the kinds of projects that we're going to be looking at in future shows.
So that's it for us today. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to check the show notes for all the references and resources, and to join us next time when we talk about communication and climate change. That's a wrap.